Rare brought the world a host of some of the most beloved characters and franchises to ever appear on the small screen. After they turned the world of video games upside down with the Donkey Kong Country series, they were ready to share one of their most iconic games to date. A game that many consider to be one of the greatest platformers of all time, and ultimately becoming one of the most critically acclaimed titles in the 64-bit era. This is the Banjo Kazooie Iceberg. Banjo's first appearance. Before becoming the all-star partner of Kazooie, Banjo the Bear starred in Diddy Kong Racing. Though the famed N64 game didn't feature Kazooie, it did feature Tip Top, who would go on to appear in Banjo Kazooie as a choir teacher inside Tank Top Shell in Bubble Gloob Swamp. During the Microsoft acquisition of Rare, Tip Top was included as a Banjo Kazooie character, confirming his connection with the series. Project Dream. Before the concept of Banjo Kazooie, the premise existed as a completely different project. After Rare's incredible work on Killer Instinct and Donkey Kong Country, two titles were greenlit. One was Donkey Kong 64, and the other was a fresh IP about a boy partaking in a magical adventure on a pirate island. This took on the codename Project Dream, otherwise known as Dream Land of Giants, and spent an exhaustive 16 months in development. DK64 went on to become fully realized, however Project Dream was scrapped. Instead, the team would utilize much of Dream's foundation, including some of the game's music, using a more fleshed out version of a character from Diddy Kong Racing, who was a secondary character in the Dream project. In 2015, Rare shared footage and insights on the cancelled game. We also learned that much of Dream's themes and concepts would serve as inspiration for one of Rare's future titles, Sea of Thieves. Stop and Swap. Perhaps the holy grail of Banjo-Kazooie mysteries, Stop and Swap was an element within BK and its sequel where the developers intended to have a number of hidden eggs and an ice key that can be obtained by swapping the Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie cartridges within 10 seconds or less. However, due to hardware limitations, the time allotted to swap between cartridges was only around 1 second. Even if it was possible, the damage it would potentially cause to the system and the hardware made it a gamble at best. There are theories abound as to its deeper aspects, such as unmentioned abilities the characters can use. Many claim the cancelled 64 disk drive was intended to be utilized to swap the data. Community members were even able to find lengthy in-game codes that could be used to unlock the eggs in the original game. Despite the mysteries revolving around the stop and swap items, the Xbox version of the game reintroduced them, except this time in correspondence to Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. As players gathered the items in the arcade version, they unlocked some of the rare vehicle parts in Nuts and Bolts. You can find a number of speculations regarding the items from the original, and many videos have been dedicated directly to them. Missing characters. After saving Tooty from Gruntilda at the finale of the first game, Tooty only makes minor cameos after it. Rare did see it fit to include an Easter egg in the sequel in the form of a missing sign featuring the character, acknowledging her disappearance, as well as a picture inside of Banjo's house. She also has a few cameos in Nuts and Bolts. Similar to Tooty, Gruntilda also has no firm reappearances after the original game. Giant's Lair. This was believed to be a cut area from the beta version of the game, alongside Mount Fire Eyes. However, according to Greg Mayles, one of the primary minds behind Banjo-Kazooie, neither the Giant's Lair nor Mount Fire Eyes officially existed. These two theorized areas were both the same area, and it simply served as a test level for development and hardware testing purposes. Mysterious Door in Grunty's Lair. There exists a door in Grunty's Lair that can be seen near the beginning of the game. Later in the game, the door can be found, however it is inaccessible. Not surprisingly, playground rumors were abound about the mysterious door, how to access, and what lies behind it. Beta Jiggy Dance. The beta version of the game featured Banjo performing a much different jiggy dance animation than the final product. Exit to Witch's Lair. This was a menu option that was found within the game's instruction manual, but it was cut from the final game. Selecting the option returned you directly to Gruntilda's lair, despite being in the middle of a mission. Musical inspirations. There are several pieces of music with clear inspiration from previously established musical pieces. The beta music for Mumbo Mountain has a riff that is uncannily similar to a classic show tune known as Baby Elephant Walk. Gruntilda's lair took heavy inspiration from the Teddy Bear's Picnic, and the theme of Click Clock Wood is based on Oh You Beautiful Doll. Beta Minjos. These small characters had a drastically altered body shape in the beta version of the game. Gruntilda Japanese version. The Japanese version of BK featured a different style of speech. It said that they wanted her to appear more old lady-like in her speech pattern by stretching out certain vowels. Beta Barry. We see a brief glimpse of the character Barry from 12 Tales Conker 64, which would go on to release as Conker's Bad Fur Day. It can be found in the original Banjo Kazooie release in the form of a poster in Rusty Bucket Bay. Conker 64 was in development at the time of Banjo Kazooie's release. Future releases of the game featured an image of Conker the Squirrel instead. Bottle's Revenge. This was a scrapped, hidden game mode that incorporated a second player in Banjo-Tooie. In it, Bottles would assume an evil ghost-like character, commonly regarded as Devil Bottles. The character would follow Banjo around, possessing nearby enemies. The second player, with a separate controller, would take control of these possessed enemies, who could use them to attack Player 1. If Player 2 would successfully defeat Banjo, the players would swap roles, allowing Player 2 to instead play Banjo, while Player 1 would assume the role of the possessed enemies. The miniature battle between Player 1 and 2 would temporarily cease during boss battles. But Rare originally intended to have the Devil Bottles character control the bosses as well, but they opted against this idea due to balancing issues. The mode was shipped with the final game, however they removed access to Bottles of Revenge from the final game, as it was not completely debugged. Players were able to find and access this hidden, unfinished game mode. The only remains of the game mode can be found in Tower of Tragedy, where an icon of Devil Bottles can be found in Banjo-Tooie. It's theorized this game mode was adapted in a very similar mode in the game Perfect Dark. Clanker is a living creature. We come to find that Grunty's glorified garbage disposal is a massive metallic shark. But upon close examination, you can find what appears to be exposed flesh. And when going inside Clanker, you can find additional fleshy mechanical parts. Many people suggest that Clanker is actually a living creature, and it's all but confirmed as the beta version also featured a real live whale shark instead of a mechanical variation. Bottles' portrait. You can find a portrait of Bottles in Banjo's house, However, Bottles introduces himself to Banjo upon their first meeting in the game, suggesting Banjo wasn't even acquainted with him until that moment. Fungi Forest. There existed another world known as Fungus World that was eventually cut before BK's release. Many speculate that it was actually an earlier incarnation of Clanker's Cavern, primarily due to pre-release footage of the game from E3 1997. It's also theorized that the Click-Clock Wood Puzzle Chamber was also originally associated with this cut world. We also see a picture in Banjo Tooie that many believe to display the cut Fungus Forest area. However, the answers were eventually provided, as the picture actually showed a prototype version of Project Dream featuring Banjo. And we would eventually see the world resurface in Rare's other project, DK64, in a slightly altered version, appropriately named Fungi Forest. Cancelled Game Boy game. BK Grunty's Curse was a cancelled Game Boy Color game that takes place several years after the events of the original game. After its cancellation, Rare altered the story to feature time travel, and it would become the Game Boy Advance game BK Grunty's Revenge. The game was not a direct one-to-one conversion, however, as the cancelled game featured levels and plot elements that never saw the light of day. It was revealed later that one massive aspect that was never utilized was seeing Kazooie turn evil at the hands of the Wicked Witch. Rated E in the 90s. Despite being rated E for everyone, including children, there exists a number of questionable scenes that would perhaps not fly in today's overly coddled world. The opening scene of Banjo Tooie features the cast of characters playing cards, complete with chips used to gamble. Mumbo even boasts about how much cash he'd taken from Banjo. It even went so far as to remark about how Banjo wouldn't even be able to afford food for Kazooie. Then Kazooie distracts the characters and steals a stack of coin from another player. When you fail to complete King Sandybutt's maze, the dynamic duo meet their horrendous demise as they are impaled by a set of spikes. The swamp water in Bubble Gloop Swamp also features various red splotches, which many speculate is actually blood. And another questionable scene occurs when you burst a boil of Lord Woo Fack Fack. They violently burst open, spewing forth blood in the water around it. After this, the spots in the fish turn into large red gashes. I'd like to take a moment of silence to remember the days before the world was overly PC, nerfing everything in the process. Cut Big Butt. Within the intro of the original game, you can see a younger version of the enemy Big Butt, who can be found in several areas within the game. This younger version cannot be found within the game itself, but it was later revealed in Rare's look at the Dream project that this younger version of Big Butt was actually an enemy within the Dream project, which was scrapped during game development. Mumbo Jumbo Mountain without ticker. At one point in the game, you're transformed into a ticker ant to travel up some heavily slanted, slippery slopes. Not surprisingly, skilled players eventually found a way to travel up the tricky terrain without the transformation. Original Canary Mary. This notoriously difficult challenge in Banjo Tooie involves the player spamming the A button as fast as possible in order to defeat the bird. Many players struggled to complete the challenge, but it was reportedly even worse in the beta. The original mechanic involved rotating the N64 control stick in a similar fashion to the infamous Mario Party games. The mechanic was changed as a result of beta testers getting blisters on their palms during the challenge. Stop and Swap 2. This is another mysterious feature found in the Xbox 360 version of Banjo Kazooie. After acquiring all the eggs and the ice key, you unlock a number of different rewards. It's suggested that this feature might be used in an upcoming Banjo Kazooie game, though many people think it's simply an allusion to the original Stop and Swap. Snacker can be killed. The seemingly undefeatable NPC shark, Snacker, can be killed via unorthodox means. This can be done by luring it near the road, crouching and using various methods to destroy it. Unused underwater themes. Freezizi Peak and Waza's Cave, despite being underwater, don't have underwater musical themes like Rusty Bucket Bay. We also learned that the engine room was intended to be flooded at one point. There was an unused underwater theme that was originally played in all 3 areas. Secret Moving Picture Game. There is a hidden minigame accessible by positioning the camera on the portrait of bottles. By completing the puzzle game, you will earn a cheat code that you can use in Treasure Trove Cove that turns you into a washing machine. 3E. The third installment in the Banjo game, Banjo 3E, was played off as a joke, accordingly to Greg Mayles, but was never considered as a real title. Grunty deletes your save file. If you used 3 cheats in the Treasure Trove Cove, the game's villain will do the unspeakable and literally delete your game file. Luckily, Bottles will give you a warning ahead of time, offering you a chance to back out of your decision. Big Clucker Cutscene. The Big Cluckers have a unique animation upon their first defeat, showing them falling down from the tree in Click Clock Wood. This is significant as cutscenes in Banjo Kazooie are used to signify something important relating to the level. However, in the case of the Big Clucker cutscene, there was no important event or action occurring other than a better view of a death animation. It's theorized that atop the tree was originally supposed to be a boss battle with a larger version of the Cluckers, and the mentioned Clucker cutscenes would have played part in that. When using the bee transformation to fly to the top of the tree to potentially gather additional clues, players are met with an invisible ceiling, preventing access. Logbox 720 theme song. At one point in this song from BK Nuts and Bolts, you can hear what sounds like a voice using a sort of talk box to sing a hidden message.
Tonight! Welcome to my world. Stupid bear and bird. Lots to do and see. Stop and swap on 360.
Some theorize it's voiced by the Lord of Games, the Grand Creator from Nuts and Bolts, while others insist it's simply a psychological effect called a mondegreen, where the brain misinterprets sound as speech. Jolly's Menu. The menu inside of Jolly Roger's Tavern contains several dishes, some based on real-life dishes, others serving as sexual innuendo. I'll let you decide which is which. Grey Jinjos. In Banjo Tooie, we learn of the 10 Jinjo families within their village. Hag 1 demolished the Grey Jinjo family house. On its way to the Cauldron Keep, each of the Grey Jinjo unfortunately perished in the process. Although they didn't make an appearance in the game as a result, players were able to find unused assets in the game that suggested the Grey Jinjos may have originally had a larger role within the game. One particularly interesting find was a removed Grey Jinjo house titled Shouldn't Be Here in the game's data. Questionable graphics. While using the flight pad in Pterodactyl Land, flying above Mumbo's hut, you can see what many claim to be a very recognizable shape. I personally see an elephant trunk sprinkling water, though others beg to differ. Another interesting and questionable design decision involved Mr. Patches, the inflatable dinosaur, covered in patches to keep it inflated. In Banjo Tooie, the plug for the inflatable toy was located in a peculiar position between his legs. Some argue it's a protruding outie belly button, again others claim to see something else. Incorrect N64 logo. The startup screen for the original game featured an N64 logo that was improperly colored. But this was not an uncommon occurrence within games, as over a third of the games on the N64 console featured this incorrectly colored logo. This happened because of the nature of the 3D logo itself. Developers were tasked with designing their own N64 logo from a static 2D image provided by Nintendo. The mistake was fixed in Banjo Tooie, reflecting the originally intended color scheme. Pink Squirrel. Inside of Click Clock Wood during the winter season, you can find a pink squirrel sleeping inside of Nab Nub's house. We never see the squirrel again throughout the game or in the ending credits of the game. Who is this squirrel? The Twinkly Muncher's Glitch. A particularly frustrating enemy known as the Twinkly Muncher tries to prevent the blue Twinklies from being accounted for. Normally you're forced to defeat it every time it pops up, but by defeating the initial enemy and running behind the box that spawns the Twinklies, you'll deload the enemy, allowing the Twinklies to travel directly to their destination with ease. Treasure Trove Cove Map. The map room in Rusty Bucket Bay has a map on the wall with an X on it. Upon close examination, you can see that the X marks Shark Food Island, while the entire map actually details Treasure Trove Cove. Grunty's Audience. When looking above the playfield in Grunty's Furnace Fun, you can find what many argue to be a crowd of onlookers in the stands to witness the hopeful demise of the bear and bird. You can see what appears to be a character very similar to Mr. Vile in several places throughout the crowd. Donkey Kong Connection. An early version of the game featured a portrait of DK in Banjo's house instead of Tootie. This is one of the main clues as to the speculation that Bottles was originally meant to be Donkey Kong. At one point, Kazooie has a line of dialogue with Bottles where Bottles is called Barrel Boy. Some people believe that this is actually leftover dialogue from before the change from Donkey Kong to Bottles. To further cement the connection, an early beta of DK64 shows what appears to be a vending machine with the iconic bear and bird on the side of it. Terrible Parents. Mr. Boggy, the polar bear, lost the presents for his kids, forcing Banjo to find them. Even after finding them, instead of going home to his children, he instead goes sledding. The player delivers the presents to the children, after which Boggy shows little consideration for them. Chris Alcock, a designer for Rare, revealed that if Banjo fails to exchange a fish for a Jiggy, Boggy would have consumed one of his children for food. This is based on real life, as male polar bears occasionally eat their young ones if they are unable to find food. And Mrs. Boggy isn't much better. Nuts and Bolts features evidence that she can be very abusive towards both her children and her husband. She reportedly knocked him out in order to keep a job he didn't like, and she also slapped him afterwards and forced him to build a new igloo for her. Mumbo Jumbo could revive Bottles. At the beginning of Tooie, Mumbo attempts to warn Bottles of Grunty's return. Bottles refuses to believe him and chooses not to evacuate the house that would be the target of Grunty's spell. As a result, Bottles met his untimely demise. At the end of the game, we see Bottles resurrected by Banjo and Kazooie. But in Hailfire Peaks, several alien creatures fall to their deaths from their UFO. Mumbo Jumbo is able to use a powerful shaman magic called Life Force to resurrect the beings. It's theorized that Mumbo could have actually revived Bottles at any point in the game instead of at the end of it, but he chose not to out of spite. LOG is evil. The Lord of Games had early concept art that portrayed him much more menacingly, using marionettes of both Banjo and Gruntilda. Some players believe that the plan was originally to have LOG serve as the primary antagonist of Nuts and Bolts instead of Gruntilda. Captain Blubber's Lube. This recurring character within the series has a cameo in another title from Rare, Grabbed by the Ghoulies. You can find Captain Blubber's lubricant Easter egg, complete with its catchy slogan, "Grease up them oars, boys." Grunty is Bikini Girl. During a game over scene, you can see Gruntilda stealing Tootie's beauty, becoming a more voluptuous version of herself. However, during the ending credits of the game, we see a random girl in a bikini with a remarkably similar body type. Some players theorize that these two characters are actually one and the same. Grunty and Mumbo Jumbo's past connection. We learn in the game's instruction manual that Mumbo Jumbo previously served as a teacher of Gruntilda. The student would eventually betray the teacher, using his own magical teachings against him. The witch cursed Mumbo Jumbo, transforming his face into a mask of horror. The previously mentioned sexy grunty cutscene shows Mumbo Jumbo coming onto her, with dialogue that some argue suggests a possible relationship as well. Conker chainsaws Banjo. Within the promo video of Rare joining Microsoft in 2002, you can see Conker carving the Rare logo out of the Xbox logo near Banjo. Another Rare character, Cameo, flies down and seduces Conker, who in turn tosses the chainsaw behind him, landing on Banjo in the process. 4-player split screen. According to Paul Machasek, a software engineer, a 4-way split screen was just days away from being ready after the cutoff point for shipping the game. Perhaps it would have been something similar to Bottle's Revenge, or perhaps it would have been something different. We may never know. Kazooie is always pregnant. Playtonic, a crew that contains a number of former members of the original Banjo Kazooie developer team, retweeted this infamous line. The tweet was later retracted, claiming they had lied about Kazooie's pregnancy. And in the ultimate twist, they later doubled down on their original statement, claiming that Kazooie is always pregnant. And not surprisingly, this spawned a wave of fan art of all sorts. Banjo X. This was a cancelled Rareware project being developed for the Xbox in 2005. The original plan was to advertise the game as a direct remake of the original game. However, the players that purchased the game would be pleasantly surprised to see a completely new game that diverged drastically from the original. It would start out as if you were playing the original game, but as the story progressed, the in-game characters would slowly gain a sort of self-awareness about having reliving the scenarios. From here, their behavior and actions, as well as the story, would veer into something entirely new. Characters from Banjo-Tooie would also make reappearances in Banjo X, and the game was experimenting with an art style that was more similar to Nuts and Bolts. For a number of reasons, including low sales on Conker Live and Reloaded, the project would never come to fruition. It was cancelled and later redeveloped into BK Nuts and Bolts. Scrapped Nuts and Bolts cartoon. Rare had another cartoon based on one of their projects, as Donkey Kong Country also had a cartoon featured directly on the game's cast. So it wasn't too surprising to see a proposed Banjo-Kazooie cartoon to be released alongside BK Nuts and Bolts. Both Rare and Microsoft approved of the project in itself, but due to challenges aligning the art style with the new game, among other complications, it would be cancelled and scrapped completely. Scrapped racing games. It seemed that the team at Rare was itching to create another racing game after Diddy Kong Racing. Banjo Kazooie is the codename of a fully fleshed out game prototype developed for the Xbox 360. It was briefly worked on just before Nuts and Bolts released. This racing game employed characters from the Banjo Kazooie universe and expanded further upon the racing parts in Nuts and Bolts. It's been said that you would construct carts out of different parts, and it would have just been seen as a precursor to Nuts and Bolts. But Rare took a shift into Connect projects exclusively, cancelling the continuation of Banjo Kazooie. But remains can be found elsewhere. Sonic and Sega All-Star Racing on the Xbox 360 featured one of the cars from the cancelled project. The other unreleased project was known as The Fast and the Furriest. Some speculate that this project was the next evolution in the development of Banjo Kazooie, but it was indeed an entirely separate title to itself. In an unlockable mini documentary short in Rare Replay, we hear Will Overton, a character artist for Fast and Furriest, briefly explain the game's general premise. He described it as an update in the evolution of the kart game genre. Rare would have taken from their large cast of characters from their franchises, Saber Wolf from Killer Instinct, Vela from Jet Force Gemini, Joanna Dark from Perfect Dark, Rash from Battletoads, and of course Banjo alongside several characters from the series, including Mumbo Jumbo, Humba Wumba, and Trophy Thomas. It featured highly customizable themed vehicles and dynamic terrain that can affect and be affected by the players. Players wielded Banjo's magical wrench that could be used to alter the environment, build and destroy bridges, and take apart enemies' cars for themselves, and more. Players could choose the kind of playstyle they wanted, between fast and agile, bulky to knock other players out of their way, or specialize in traps against others. It was all about changing the map, changing your car, and changing the way you play accordingly. Unfortunately, it met the same fate as many other ambitious Rare projects before it. Banjo with a chainsaw. During Rare's 2015 Creative Jam, a small team created a short film titled Night Rare that featured somebody in a banjo costume stalking people with a chainsaw. It even includes a cameo from Greg Mayles, who is said to be slain by the bear off-screen. Banjo Kazooie Real Life Connection. Several elements of the game suggest that there are some overlapping elements between our reality and the Banjo Kazooie universe. The Rusty Bucket boat displays Twycross, England, a real-life location. Also, the official Banjo Kazooie Player's Guide mentions the events of the Titanic and Leonardo DiCaprio existing within their universe. And finally, during the credits of the original game, the characters are aware they're in a game, even watching the cast of the characters and mentioning secrets from the next game. Banjo is Napper and Clinker. The voices of both of these characters are actually the same voices used for Banjo, simply slowed and toned down. Mumbo Jumbo is a Jinjo. In a tweet, Ed Bryan, a character designer for BK, as well as the original creator of Mumbo Jumbo, confirmed that the character is indeed a Jinjo, complete with a number of shared body parts, as well as it being canonically accurate within the story. Banjo traumatized the Keebler elves. In the 90s, there was a commercial for Keebler products that incorporated Banjo and Kazooie. Aside from the traumatized Keebler elf, the dude wasn't aware that the magical puzzle pieces were called Jiggies, and the commercial ends with Banjo and Kazooie chasing down the elf that accidentally packaged it. Playable Tootie in Banjo Kazooie. At the end of the game, Grunty tosses one Hail Mary spell towards Banjo. It ends up missing the player, but in the beta version of the game, it featured a much different scene. The spell actually hit Banjo and turned him into a frog. From here, the player took control of Tootie, who would revisit the areas of the game to collect Mumbo tokens necessary to return Banjo to his bear form. Due to time constraints, the mode was scrapped. Boggy's Kids in Banjo Land. The three children of Mr. and Mrs. Bogley, aptly named Soggy, Moggy, and Groggy, were originally meant to be in Nuts and Bolts, but were cut due to time limitations. They would have been part of a Jiggy challenge titled Don't Bring Your Kids to Work Day. Amazingly enough, more than 10 years after the game's release, players were able to find 2 of the 3 children hidden within the game. Both Soggy and Moggy were discovered in the game with incomplete models, but they did have their appropriately named AI. Unfortunately, Groggy remains undiscovered to this day. Five Nights at Banjo's. The German equivalent for the magazine Nintendo Power, called Club Nintendo, would occasionally run mini comic stories that would feature the Banjo-Kazooie cast. The art style took on a much more peculiar tone, different from the game's artistic vision. and many people argue that it resembled something akin to the creepy art style of Five Nights at Freddy's.
Like this video and subscribe to Maker.